perform to any of their allies or any of their clients. We've got to cut them off. The economy in Iran is collapsing. The people now have been driven into abject poverty. The only rich people in Iran now are the mullahs themselves and the IRGC and the IRGC officers, many of whom, by the way, have wealthy villas in the West, who send, and in Turkey and countries like that, who send their kids to private schools. They are corrupt, but they are the ones that have stolen the wealth of the Iranian people, as well as spending it on developing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and spending it on Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. So, of course, further and tougher sanctions, maximum pressure sanctions, are utterly essential. We've also got to realize that people now in the West, and this is reflected often in some of the Western media, they say, but hang on, we don't want to end up with a similar situation that happened in Iraq. You know, we don't want to see the tumbling of this regime, no matter how evil they are, and then in its wake, chaos. Well, you can be certain of one thing: that will not happen. There is an organized resistance movement, a democratic resistance movement. There is a government in exile waiting to step in when the mullahs are fleeing to Moscow, as Bob said. They have a 10-point plan now, which I would be happy to stand for election to implement such a platform. They will bring free democratic elections to the people of Iran within 6 months of overthrowing the mullahs. They will rewrite the constitution to make sure that Iran has freedom, justice, has an end to misogyny, an end to the death penalty and torture, an end to the nuclear threat, an end to warmongering. This is the future that we could see for the Iranian people. And it's a country that is rich in resources, and the people could be wealthy, could be happy if we got rid of this evil regime.
Yes. And
Antonio, could I respond to that?
Yes, please.
So I think it is notable to your question about the sanctions going forward and oil sales. Something that went largely unnoticed, I think, in the international media. Before Donald Trump appointed Marco Rubio Secretary of State, the first appointment he made in American foreign policy was Brian Hook. Brian Hook ran the transition for the State Department. Brian Hook is the person who ran economic sanctions against Iran during the first Trump presidency. So you have a Biden presidency, which for a variety of reasons did not enforce the sanctions as much as it could have. I think it did not want problems with oil prices. It had an illusion that it could somehow engage in constructive dialogue with Iran. So the sanctions were not what they could have been, and oil sales were not contained as much as they could have been. Now you have the Trump administration, which by Kellogg's own words is maximum pressure. But it is notable that Brian Hook has played this role since he is the sanctions person. And the other thing that has changed is the oil posture. The United States is now the largest producer of oil in the world. We don't import oil largely from the Middle East, which frees up that oil for other people. So they don't need Iranian oil. Second, the Trump administration is promising to increase American production by another 3 million barrels. That will create a glut in the world. So Iranian oil will become even less important. My challenge to our European friends would be that Iranian oil is largely being consumed by the Chinese. And the United States should be joined by our British, French, Italian, and German allies by suggesting to the Chinese, this is not a responsible thing to do. There is other oil available. You don't need to be buying Iranian oil. Become part of the international coalition. So I think the market is working for us. I think increased production is working for us. I'd like to see more international cooperation work for us to choke that last remaining pipeline, literally, of Iranian exports. And finally, to Strawn's point, to those who are arguing against maximum confrontation to avoid chaos in Iran, like happened with the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, there are enormous differences. And Strawn pointed to some of them. Another one is Iran is a real country. Iraq was constructed and put together, has had enormous internal demographic divisions for years. Iran has been a country for 5,000 years. It is not going to fall apart. It is simply going to change governance. And we're going to replace what is now chaos. When you kill 750 of your own people, you hang political prisoners, and you're killing people on the streets. That's chaos. Replacing the regime and getting a democratic government, that ends chaos. Yeah. But I don't have the slightest fear of the country falling apart into divisions. It predates the Roman Empire. I don't think we've got that problem.
Antonio, could I add another point?
Yes, please, go on.
Every time there is a crisis inside Iran, at the time of the uprisings, the nationwide uprisings, now again with the fall of Bashar al-Assad, suddenly we see the strange and bizarre emergence of the crown prince, so-called, Pahlavi, the son of the deposed Shah. Now, the Shah was deposed in 1979 because he was the ultimate tyrant, cruel to his own people, a total dictator. And sadly, the people of Iran fell then from the frying pan into the fire when the mullahs hijacked the revolution and took over, and the situation has become bad. But every time Reza Pahlavi, the son of the deposed Shah, who stole billions from the people of Iran when he fled from the country during the revolution, and on which Reza Pahlavi has been living lavishly in luxury ever since. Every time he smells an opportunity for a return to power in his concept, he suddenly emerges doing news broadcasts and talking to the media. The people of Iran do not want to return to the tyranny of the Shah. You hear them during the protests, during the uprisings, chanting, "No to the Sheikh, no to the Shah." They don't want to return to another form of tyranny, whether it be the monarchy or the son of the Shah as the so-called crown prince. He has been virtually invisible for the past 45 years. And it is a joke. He's a laughingstock now if he thinks that he has any role to play in the future of a democratic Iran once the mullahs are overthrown.
So, Strawn, I don't know whether on your side of the Atlantic, with your version of the English language, you have this expression, but in our version of the English language, we have this expression: if we didn't have him, we'd have to invent him. And if the Shah did not have a son, the mullahs would have to invent him because he is perfect for their narrative. They want to create this false dichotomy that if you didn't have the brutality of the mullahs, you'd have the Shah's son back. Well, that's a false choice. Nobody wants the Shah's son back. The alternative is a free, democratic government, of which I think the MEK has has a principal role in a broad coalition of democratic forces. So nothing serves the mullah's purposes better than the Shah's son. And as you're pointing out, every time there's a moment of opportunity here, he's resurrected as this false narrative. If he did not exist, the mullahs would have to invent him.
You know, Reza Pahlavi, in an interview a couple of years ago, even said that if he came back into power in Iran after the overthrow of the mullahs, he would continue to work with the IRGC to maintain authority, to maintain control in Iran. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, they are like Hitler's Gestapo. They're the ones that are murdering and hanging and shooting in the street the ordinary citizens of Iran. And Reza Pahlavi says he has been in communication with them. He wants to continue to work with them if he ever came back to power. Well, God help us that that should never happen.
So you mentioned the IRGC, and there is still some people that think that they are so strong, the regime is ruthless, and they suggest that there is no force inside Iran to overthrow the regime. They raise concern on possible changes if the regime falls. And so it is the moment, I think, to listen to a few words that Secretary Mike Pompeo said in one of the conferences in Paris last week, because he clearly rejected the idea, the notion that the regime is so strong and there is no alternative. Let's listen to what Mike Pompeo said. We should have a clip with Secretary Pompeo.
At its core, and the resistance units throughout the country. These units must be and are the decisive force in the transformation that must be recognized. And here I want to take a moment to make a crucial point. This plan does not demand regime change from outside, from the United States or others. It doesn't ask for boots on the ground or even money from outside. Mr. Mujahedin, you've repeatedly stated there's only a single path, one path to the regime's end, and that is being achieved by the Iranian people and the organized resistance inside of Iran. The only demand of the resistance is that the recognition of the Iranian people's plight to bring about the end of the regime is proper. The right of the resistance units to combat the regime's repressive forces, especially the IRGC. We and all the freedom-loving people must give them this recognition. Your 10-point plan, Mr. Mujahedin, your 10-point plan includes free elections within 6 months, half a year of the regime's overthrow, separation of religion and state, gender equality, and a non-nuclear Iran. This deserves every nation's support. Mrs. Mary Mujahedin heads a democratic alternative that has demonstrated its capability over now 4 decades against the mullah's dictatorship.
So, Robert and Struan, how do you see what Secretary Pompeo said? So I believe you both consider quite feasible that the regime can fall in a short time. And what you both think about the role of the units of resistance, the resistance units of the MEK in Iran?
Well, I've seen Mike Pompeo, when he was Secretary of State, speaking about Iran on many occasions. This is the first time, interestingly, when he was in Paris last weekend, that I've seen him actually focusing on the resistance units, on the MEK itself, on Mrs. Rajavi and her 10-point plan. He is now putting his finger on the future for the Iranian people, getting rid of the mullahs and looking to the democratic opposition movement, the MEK, as the clear and obvious replacement. And it's also, you know, what General Kellogg said last weekend as well. He said 2025 had to be the year of hope, action, and change. And I think that encompasses what exactly we want to happen. They are now at the edge of a cliff, the mullahs. We need the West, the international community, to help in pushing them over that cliff and restoring freedom and justice and democracy to the people of Iran.
Of course, I fully agree. And I would say that being a citizen of the European Union, I absolutely support a common and strong Euro-Atlantic position on Iran. What about you, Robert?
I thought Secretary Pompeo made an important point there, really speaking directly to the people of Iran, that to note this is your revolution. You're the lead. We can offer support, we can follow, we can help, but a revolution that is going to have meaning and credibility and is going to last comes from the streets of Iran, its own people, forming its own government, true to its own democratic principles. We are all actors in that fight, but we are not the leads of that fight. The cells of the MEK now has operating around Iran. The people independently taking to the streets, whether they're putting slogans on walls or throwing rocks or holding signs, whatever they're doing. This is your revolution. It's your lead. Our responsibility is to do everything we can that supports you. And I was struck in listening to the idea that that's easy to say, but the IRGC has such a hold that a revolution from within is not possible. I was very involved in the first American war with Saddam Hussein. I remember how the United States prepared for war with the Presidential Guard, these elite troops like the IRGC that were dedicated to defend the Iraqi regime to the death, engaging in the same kind of torture and abuse of their citizens as the IRGC. And how in a matter of days, the streets of Baghdad were littered with their uniforms. They couldn't get their uniforms off fast enough, get rid of their identifications, blend into the population, claim they were on the other side. That's what will happen with the IRGC. These people you fear will melt away the minute the revolution begins.
Yeah.
Yes, and you know, there is another point that is very interesting for me, because there is an argument that somebody say that there is no viable alternative. You already said, Struan, that of course the alternative cannot be the son of the former Shah. But people may say there is no viable alternative because the opposition is fragmented. So let's see what Speaker John Bercow said on this point at the conference in Paris, and then I would like to listen to both your opinions.
And yet there are still people who say in the Iranian context there is no alternative. And I think what those of us here to support you in our different ways, with our different words, but with a similar message, are here to assert today is that this is the alternative. The existence of a 4.5-decade-long established resistance force characterized by its commitment to democracy, to pluralism, to justice, to the rule of law, to environmental propriety, to equality for women, for a secular state, for the abolition of the death penalty, and indeed for a changed constitution and a non-nuclear state. So that is the alternative. It is a democratic alternative.
So you can comment on this and give your opinion on what Mr. Berko said.
Well,
Well,
of course. Yeah, go ahead, Bo.
The notion there's not an alternative is absurd. In my years in the American government, I've watched the overthrow of tyrants from South Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. In none of those places did I ever see in organized opposition with a platform, established leaders, credibility that I now see in Iran. None of those countries had the same kind of infrastructure in waiting. Think about this last weekend. You have had the democratic organized opposition in Iran host the former Prime Minister of Britain, having been followed in previous years by the Prime Minister of Canada, the Secretary of State of the United States, having been followed by the foreign secretaries in previous years of Germany, Italy, Britain, and France. There's more diplomatic contact internationally with the MEK and the organized opposition than there is with the government in Tehran. There's more discourse and a better international following. So it isn't a question of whether or not there's an alternative. It is the best alternative I have ever seen for a revolution in waiting anywhere.
Yeah, and we have over 3,000 of these former prime ministers, former presidents, former chancellors, former ministers, Nobel Prize winners who have signed a letter backing Mrs. Rajavi and the National Council of Resistance of Iran, calling for the overthrow of the regime. This is a massive international congregation of people that support what Mrs. Rajavi and the democratic opposition of the NCRI have been fighting and giving so much effort to achieve for years. So we really look to the brave resistance units in Iran. We look to the courageous people in Ashraf 3 in Albania for the support that they have provided, the backbone that they have provided to the movement for a long, long time, and the sacrifices that all of them have made. Indeed, inside Iran itself, these sacrifices, people that write graffiti on a wall saying that they support the MEK face the death penalty. That is the extent of the brutality of this regime. So we should not ever underestimate the courage of these people. And the West now must back them in their right to overthrow this evil regime.
And Sharon, to those who are suggesting that, well, there's not an alternative, there's no place to rally. 2 months ago in Syria, we didn't even know who these people were.
Yeah.
They were occupying a single city in a corner of the country. They had no infrastructure, unknown leadership, questionable military abilities, and no platform. Think of the difference. In Iran, we have an internationally recognized, capable leadership with enormous intellectual depth and experience, recognition throughout the world, with an established platform of how to govern the country in accord with international democratic principles. It is day and night. Those who think that there's not an alternative are searching for an excuse not to have the despotic regime fall in Tehran. We have a very real alternative in the MEK and Mrs. Rajavi and this broad coalition.
So as I said, as I reminded, Stuart Stevenson has been a long-time member of the European Parliament. Although now the United Kingdom is not anymore within the EU, and I personally miss it, but I would like to ask Stuart what you think that are the changes that maybe you hope to see or that can be likely to happen in the European policy towards Iran after what was said in this conference, after the participation of key political figures. What can we expect by the European countries and the European Union in a change in the policy towards Iran?
Well, of course, we have a new parliament elected in June of last year, but just before those elections, the European Parliament voted unanimously to blacklist the IRGC. And indeed, the president of the Parliament said that she was entirely in support of doing that. But for some reason, the Commission have dragged their feet on this. I want to see them take action now. They surely must recognize that this is a gangster regime and that blacklisting the IRGC is absolutely essential. This is a regime that attempted to assassinate and almost succeeded in assassinating a previous senior vice president of the European Parliament, our great friend and colleague Alejo Vidal-Quadras. In November 22, in November 23, they attempted to assassinate him in broad daylight outside his home in Madrid. And now most of the gang who were involved in a lengthy process of planning the assassination, when he was shot in the head outside his home, most of them have been arrested, including the guy who fired the gun itself, all of them directly linked to the Iranian regime. And this will emerge in due course when they go on trial. And even every time any of us say this, you never hear any protests from the Iranian ambassadors because they know that they were behind this. So it's time, you know, when we see a regime that is prepared to kill its opponents, to kill Western leading politicians who criticize them, to plan their assassination, who indeed planned to assassinate President-elect Donald Trump. It is time for the European Parliament to take action and blacklist the IRGC and close down all their embassies, withdraw their ambassadors from Iran.
I believe that the three of us consider very important the transatlantic cooperation, as I mentioned before, a joint firm approach by European Union, UK, USA on Iran. And so what do you think about this and how this cooperation can be improved in the current geopolitical climate?
Bob, are you?
Well, there are obviously going to be some strains in the transatlantic relationships on a variety of issues, but I'll repeat myself simply because I think it is so important. I think the most important thing that can happen within the transatlantic community is that to the extent that the United States has on its agenda in speaking with the Indian and Chinese governments, they're curtailing the importation of Iranian oil, which is the only lifeline keeping the lights on in the mullahs' palaces, that become equally important in the European community generally and the German, French, Italian, and British governments specifically. They can have more sway, perhaps, but certainly collectively we have exponentially more influence if we're on the same page. There is no reason, as I suggested earlier, for India or China to be outside the international community in isolating Iran economically. It is not in Chinese or Indian interests to have an outlaw government pursuing nuclear weapons, abusing its own people, supporting terror organizations around the world. India and China have a stake in international stability and peace as well. They need to join. If they're not joining the sanctions regime, they can at least not take advantage of the opportunity to buy cheaper Iranian oil and give us that much help. If I could get one thing in your pan-European American cooperation, it would be delivering that message.
So thank you very much to Robert Riselli, Senator Riselli, for your illuminating discussion. Robert and Struan Stevenson, I think we had the opportunity to understand many points on the current situation of Iran, transatlantic approach, the US new administration, and so on. And I also would like to thank the about 4,000 people that have been watching our conversation or our transatlantic conference on Twitter. So thank you once more, and I'm sure we will meet again and again in different occasions and one day in a free Iran.
Good to be with you.
Thank you very much.